A Navy SEAL once said the most dangerous moment in a mission is when you ignore the first warning. Years after leaving the battlefield, Maddox thought he had escaped those moments forever, until his German shepherd suddenly refused to walk past a quiet greenhouse in a peaceful town. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't pull away. It simply stopped, as if something inside that building mattered more than moving forward. Inside was a woman everyone in town believed had been saved by kindness. But sometimes the stories we hear are not the whole truth. What began as a simple pause soon unraveled a hidden system of control, one that had been quietly shaping a woman's life for years. And in that moment, Maddox realized his dog wasn't sensing danger. It was sensing someone who needed the world to finally pay attention. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Early spring arrived quietly in Brightwater Cove, the kind of quiet that made sound feel unnecessary. The snow had melted only a week earlier, leaving behind damp soil and the clean scent of pine drifting down from the forested hills. The lake at the center of town reflected a pale sky that seemed too wide for such a small place. To most people, the town felt peaceful. To Maddox Varren, it felt unfamiliar in a way that almost hurt. He had arrived 3 days earlier in a dusty pickup truck that looked older than the town's welcome sign. Maddox was 37, standing a little over 6 feet tall, around 1.83 meters, with the kind of lean, hardened build that came from years of training rather than gym mirrors. His shoulders were broad but not bulky, his movements controlled and economical, like someone who had spent a long time learning how not to waste energy. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than strict SEAL regulation. His face was clean-shaven, exposing a square jaw and sharply defined cheekbones, features shaped by wind, cold air, and years spent outdoors. His skin was light but weathered, touched by the pale burn of northern climates. His eyes were the most striking part of him, a gray-blue color, calm and distant, the eyes of someone who watched everything and spoke little. He wore the same outfit every day since arriving. An old olive-green tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened from years of wear, faintly frayed at the cuffs and shoulders. Over it, faded patches of color showed where the sun and repeated washing had stripped the original shade. His combat pants, once sharp military issue, were now worn into comfort. The knees carried small scars from hard surfaces, and the cargo pockets sagged slightly from use. Heavy work boots completed the look, dark leather scuffed across the toes. On his left wrist rested an old military watch, scratched but dependable. Maddox had not chosen Brightwater Cove for beauty. He had chosen it because it was quiet. After leaving the Navy SEALs earlier than anyone expected, he had learned that quiet places asked fewer questions. And right now, questions were the last thing he wanted. The only constant companion he had brought with him was Sable. The dog trotted beside him along the gravel path that curved between the town's small library and the community greenhouse. Sable was a German shepherd, around 4.5 years old, with a coat of golden tan fur across the chest and legs and deep black along the back and ears. His body was strong and balanced, muscle without heaviness, built for endurance rather than intimidation. His ears stood alert, triangular and precise, and his amber eyes moved constantly, scanning the environment with quiet intelligence. Unlike many dogs, Sable rarely barked. He watched. He assessed. When he did react, it usually meant something had already changed. Maddox trusted the dog more than he trusted most people, which was ironic considering the reason he was here. 3 years earlier, during a mission overseas, Maddox had ignored a signal from a military working dog attached to the team. The dog had stiffened before entering a building, ears high, body tense. But there had been no visible threat. Maddox had assumed it was nerves. He ordered the team forward. Inside the structure, they discovered too late that someone had been hiding there, a civilian who had become trapped in the crossfire that followed. The situation was contained. The report called it unavoidable. But Maddox remembered the moment before the door opened. The dog had known something, and Maddox had chosen not to listen. That decision had followed him ever since. Brightwater Cove felt almost unreal compared to the places Maddox had spent most of his life. The town was small enough that people waved when they passed each other on the street. A wooden pier stretched into the lake where fishermen cast lines at dawn. Tall pine trees framed nearly every road, their branches whispering when the wind moved through them. He had rented a small cabin at the edge of the forest, just far enough from town to hear the owls at night. His routine had already begun forming: morning walks with Sable, coffee from the lakeside stand, repairing small things around the cabin, learning how to breathe without listening for distant engines. On the third morning, Maddox and Sable followed a narrow gravel path behind the Brightwater Cove Library, a brick building with tall windows and faded white trim. Beyond it stood the community greenhouse, a long structure of glass panels framed in pale metal. Inside, rows of green plants caught the morning sunlight like small islands of life. Sable slowed, then stopped. Maddox felt the leash tighten gently in his hand. He looked down. The dog stood perfectly still, not barking, not pulling, just watching. Maddox followed Sable's gaze through the greenhouse glass. Inside stood a woman arranging trays of seedlings. Her name, he would later learn, was Elena Wren. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, perhaps 34, with a slender build and quiet posture. She stood around 5'6" or 7, her movements careful and deliberate, as though every object she touched mattered. Her light brown hair was tied loosely at the back of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame a pale fin touched by freckles. She wore a simple outfit that matched the calm environment around her. A soft beige cardigan over a pale blue blouse, gray trousers, and practical brown shoes. Nothing about her looked remarkable, and yet there was something about the way she moved, careful, measured, like someone who had learned not to draw attention. Maddox noticed Sable's posture shift slightly forward. The dog was not aggressive, but he was alert, very alert. Inside the greenhouse, Elena reached upward for a tray of small plants. As she lifted it, the sleeve of her cardigan slid back slightly. For a moment, a faint bruise appeared along her wrist, not fresh but not fully healed either. Elena quickly tugged the sleeve back down. Her face did not change, but Maddox saw it. And something about the calmness of her reaction felt familiar, too familiar. Sable let out the softest sound, barely more than a breath through his nose. Then he took one deliberate step forward, his ears lifting higher. At that exact moment, Elena looked up. Her eyes met the dog's through the greenhouse glass. For just a second, something passed across her face, not fear, not surprise, but recognition. As if she understood the look animals gave when they noticed something people pretended not to see. Then she glanced away, and the moment disappeared. Maddox tugged gently on the leash. "Easy," he muttered. Sable hesitated. Then reluctantly he moved. They continued down the path, the greenhouse fading behind them. But Maddox felt a small weight settle in the back of his mind. It was the same feeling he had experienced years ago, right before opening that door. The rest of the day passed quietly. He fixed a loose board on the cabin porch. He drove into town once for supplies. People were friendly in the casual way small towns often were. One man nodded to him outside the hardware store. "New around here?" Maddox simply replied, "Yeah." No further questions came. That suited him. Night arrived slowly in Brightwater Cove. The sky turned deep blue and the lake reflected the first scattered dew. Inside the cabin, Maddox sat at the small wooden table with a mug of coffee while Sable lay near the door. Or at least he tried to. The dog didn't settle. Instead, Sable paced once across the room, then again. Finally, he stopped near the window facing town. He sat, still, watching. Maddox followed the direction of the dog's gaze. From this distance, the town lights looked small and harmless. The greenhouse roof caught a faint reflection of moonlight. "Something bothering you?" Maddox asked quietly. Sable did not move, but his ears remained forward, focused. The dog stayed there for nearly 10 minutes before finally lying down. Even then, his eyes remained open. Maddox leaned back in his chair. The cabin creaked softly around him as the temperature dropped. For a long time, he stared at the window. He had come here to escape the past, to stop replaying the same memory. But tonight something inside him stirred again. That old question, the one he had never answered. What if I had stopped that day? He looked down at the dog now resting beside the door. Sable had rarely hesitated during their years together, but when he did, it usually meant something. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and lake water. Brightwater Cove slept peacefully, but inside the cabin, Maddox Varren remained awake long after midnight. Because deep down, he knew one thing with uncomfortable certainty. Sable almost never stopped walking without a reason, and this time, the dog had refused to move. Morning in Brightwater Cove began with the quiet rhythm of small-town life. Doors unlocking, truck engines warming, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery at the corner of Harbor Street. Maddox Varren walked along the wooden boardwalk that curved beside the lake, Sable pacing calmly at his side. The dog's gait was relaxed today, tail level, ears moving occasionally at distant sounds. The creak of docks, a gull crying overhead. But Maddox noticed that every so often Sable glanced toward town rather than the forest, toward the greenhouse. Maddox had learned long ago not to force meaning onto every movement an animal made, but neither did he ignore patterns. And Sable had been forming one. The town was beginning to form patterns too. Brightwater Cove wasn't large, barely more than a few thousand residents, and in places like this, new faces traveled through conversation faster than traffic. Maddox noticed it the moment he stepped into the Harbor Bean Cafe, a small wooden coffee shop facing the water. The bell above the door chimed softly. Inside stood a woman behind the counter wiping a ceramic mug with a towel. Her name, as he would soon learn, was Marlene Shaw. Marlene looked to be in her early 50s. She had short silver hair cut neatly around her ears, warm brown eyes, and a sturdy build shaped by years of standing behind the same counter. Her skin carried the soft lines of someone who had spent much of her life smiling at strangers. She glanced up when Maddox entered. Her eyes immediately flicked to Sable. "Well now," she said with a quiet chuckle, "that's the most polite-looking shepherd I've seen in a while." Sable sat automatically beside Maddox, posture straight but relaxed. Maddox ordered a black coffee. Marlene poured it slowly, studying him with the curious friendliness typical of small-town people who didn't quite believe in strangers staying strangers for long. "You're the fellow who rented Calder's old cabin?" she said. Maddox nodded. "Just passing through?" she asked. "Staying for a while?" She set the mug in front of him. "Well, then you'll meet her soon enough." "Meet who?" Maddox asked. Marlene tilted her head slightly toward the street. "Judith Vale." The name was spoken the way people mention someone important, not loudly but with quiet certainty that the listener would understand. When Maddox didn't respond, Marlene continued, "She's the reason half this town still works the way it does." Over the next few minutes, Maddox heard the same story told in pieces: Brightwater Cove's library renovation, the community greenhouse, the local scholarship fund, several housing programs for women who needed temporary support, all of it connected back to one person, Judith Vale. Her name appeared on plaques around town, on benches, on buildings, on donation boards. Marlene didn't speak about her with fear or suspicion. She spoke with respect. "Judith's been looking after people here for nearly 20 years, she said while wiping the counter. "Some folks like to think towns run themselves, but that's not true. Someone always ends up carrying the weight." She lowered her voice slightly, "and that someone's usually Judith." Maddox thanked her and stepped back outside. Sable walked beside him again, calm but attentive. Across the street, the library doors opened and several people stepped out carrying books and papers. Among them was Elena Wren. Elena looked different in daylight outside the greenhouse. She moved carefully down the steps, holding a stack of folders against her chest. Her light brown hair was tied loosely behind her head again, and she wore the same simple clothes Maddox had seen the day before: soft cardigan, pale blouse, gray trousers. Her posture remained composed, but Maddox noticed something subtle. She walked slightly faster whenever someone called her name, as though she had grown used to answering requests before they were repeated. Sable noticed her too. His ears lifted slightly, but he remained seated. Then another figure stepped through the library doorway behind Elena. The energy around the entrance shifted almost instantly. Judith Vale emerged with the composed presence of someone accustomed to being watched. She appeared to be in her early 60s, though she carried herself with the careful grace of someone who had never allowed age to slow her posture. Judith stood tall, around 5'9" or 10, with a strong frame softened by elegant clothing. Her silver blonde hair was pulled neatly into a low knot, every strand in place. Her skin was pale, smooth, and lightly lined at the corners of her eyes. Those eyes were steel gray, not cold but calculating. She wore a long, cream-colored wool coat, tailored perfectly to her figure, with a dark turtleneck beneath and charcoal trousers that moved fluidly when she walked. Nothing about her appearance looked accidental. Judith stepped beside Elena and spoke to someone further down the steps, smiling warmly. From a distance, the scene looked entirely normal, a respected woman speaking with townspeople. Elena stood slightly behind her shoulder, not hidden, but positioned. Maddox noticed the difference immediately. Years of training had taught him to read formations even when no one realized they were standing in one, and this was a formation. Judith placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder while speaking. The gesture lasted only a moment. But Sable reacted. The dog's head lifted, his gaze locked on Judith, not aggressive, but focused in the way animals become when they notice tension beneath calm surfaces. Maddox felt the leash tighten slightly in his hand. Judith continued speaking to a passing couple, her tone warm and relaxed. "Elena has been organizing the spring planting schedule," she said. "She's the one who keeps that greenhouse alive." The couple nodded approvingly. Elena gave a small, polite smile. But Maddox noticed something else. Elena answered a question directed at Judith before Judith even opened her mouth. Not rudely, just quickly, automatically, like someone who had learned how conversations were supposed to flow. Over the next several days, Maddox saw the same pattern repeated. Judith appeared in different places across town, at the greenhouse, at the library, at a small meeting outside the town hall. And every time Elena was nearby, not always beside her, but always within reach. Maddox didn't need to ask many questions. Small towns provided answers naturally. One afternoon near the pier, he overheard two fishermen talking. "Judith's the reason that greenhouse even exists," one said. "And Elena?" the other asked. The first man shrugged. "Girl came here years ago with nothing. Judith took her in, helped her get back on her feet." A pause. "Lucky thing, too. Would have been rough otherwise." The story sounded simple, clean, almost admirable. But Maddox had begun noticing details that didn't fit the simplicity. Elena's work schedule seemed to change frequently depending on Judith's plans. Several documents he saw her carrying bore the logo of the Vale Community Foundation, and whenever Judith addressed her, Elena responded with a careful tone, not fearful, but precise, like someone navigating invisible rules. Late one afternoon, Maddox and Sable passed the greenhouse again. The doors were open to let the warm air circulate inside. Rows of green plants filled the long glass structure. Elena stood near a table arranging soil trays. Judith stood beside her, speaking quietly. From outside, Maddox could not hear the words, but he saw something that made him stop walking. Judith handed Elena a clipboard. Elena reached for it. Their hands brushed. And for just 1 second, Elena's fingers tightened. Not around the clipboard, but around her own wrist, as if steadying something inside herself. Sable saw it too. The dog didn't bark, he didn't growl. But he shifted forward half a step, placing his body directly between Maddox and the greenhouse door. Watching. Waiting. Then Judith looked toward the path. Her eyes met Maddox's, her smile widened politely, and the moment vanished. Judith stepped outside to greet him. Her voice was calm, controlled. "You must be new to Brightwater Cove." Up close, Maddox could see that Judith's composure was even more precise than it appeared from afar. Every gesture was measured. Even her breathing seemed unhurried. "Maddox Varren," he replied. Judith extended her hand. Her handshake was firm. "I'm Judith Vale." Her eyes flicked briefly to Sable. "Beautiful dog." Sable remained silent, gaze steady. "He keeps me company," Maddox said. Judith nodded approvingly. "Well, Brightwater Cove is a place where people tend to find what they need." Her tone carried no arrogance, only confidence. Behind her, Elena had resumed working among the plants. She did not join the conversation. But Maddox noticed that she remained close enough to hear. After a few more polite exchanges, Judith excused herself and returned inside. Elena continued arranging seedlings. She never looked directly at Maddox. Not once. As Maddox and Sable walked back toward the road, the late afternoon sun reflected off the greenhouse glass, scattering light across the path. Sable glanced back over his shoulder, then forward again. Maddox said nothing, but a realization had begun forming. In places like Brightwater Cove, people rarely locked doors they didn't need to. Because sometimes the strongest cages weren't made of metal. Sometimes they were built out of gratitude, and the people living inside them never realized the door had been open the whole time, or that someone else was holding the key. The following days in Brightwater Cove unfolded with the quiet rhythm of a town that had long ago learned how to appear peaceful. Morning light drifted slowly across the lake, turning the water pale silver before warming into blue. Fishermen gathered near the docks with thermoses of coffee. A delivery truck rattled past the bakery. The smell of pine and damp earth floated down from the hills. For most people, life here followed familiar patterns, but Maddox Varren had begun noticing things that didn't quite fit. He didn't confront anyone. He simply watched. That was a habit he had never unlearned. Sable helped. The German shepherd moved beside him through town with the quiet alertness of a working dog, even though his service years were technically over. At 4.5 years old, Sable still carried the energy of an animal built for purpose. His golden and black coat gleamed under the sunlight, and his amber eyes tracked movement with quiet intelligence. Sometimes he looked like he was simply enjoying a walk. Other times, Maddox recognized the subtle signs that meant the dog had noticed something: the lifting of an ear, a pause mid-step, a quiet shift in breathing. None of it dramatic, but never meaningless. One afternoon, Maddox wandered toward the bait and tackle shop near the lake's western dock. The building was old wood, painted a weathered shade of green that had faded unevenly over the years. Fishing rods leaned against the wall outside, and a faded sign reading "Pike's Supplies" creaked softly in the wind. Inside smelled like lake water, metal hooks, and motor oil. Behind the counter stood Eamon Pike. Eamon looked exactly like someone who had spent his entire life near water. He was in his early 70s, tall but slightly stooped with age. Standing around 5'9", his thin white hair stuck out from beneath a gray wool cap, and a short, uneven white beard framed a face weathered by sun and cold. His hands were large and rough, fingers thick from decades of tying nets and pulling ropes. Despite the age in his bones, his eyes were sharp and watchful, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had spent years scanning lake surfaces for trouble. "You're the new fellow in Calder's cabin," Eamon said, without looking up from the fishing reel he was repairing. His voice carried the gravelly calm of someone who rarely raised it. Maddox nodded slightly. "That obvious?" Eamon finally looked up. "In a town like this? Always." His gaze drifted to Sable. "Well now," he murmured, "that dog's not just a pet." Maddox raised an eyebrow. "Used to work with me?" Eamon nodded slowly. "Thought so." The old man set the reel down and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Dogs like that don't stop paying attention just because people decide they're retired." He leaned slightly on the counter. "Neither do the people who worked with them." For a moment the two men studied each other. Eamon seemed to recognize something in Maddox without asking about it. Eventually he said quietly, "You're watching things around here." It wasn't a question. Maddox didn't answer immediately. Eamon didn't press. Instead, he said something else. "In small towns, folks don't lie much. They just leave parts out." He gave a slight nod toward the road, "especially when it comes to Judith Vale." Maddox didn't ask more, but the conversation lingered. Later that same day, he walked toward the Brightwater Cove Library again. The building stood in a clearing surrounded by tall maples whose leaves had just begun to return after winter. Sunlight filtered through them in scattered patches that moved slowly across the grass. Inside, the quiet smell of old paper and polished wood filled the air. Near the back of the room, several children sat at a table covered with sketchbooks and colored pencils. Standing beside them was Maris Cole. Maris looked to be around 38, tall and slender with an easy posture that made her seem comfortable in any room. Her dark brown hair fell just past her shoulders in loose waves, often pushed behind one ear when she leaned over a drawing table. Her skin carried a light sun-kissed tone, and her eyes were a warm hazel, always moving between the children's work with patient attention. She wore paint-speckled jeans, a soft gray sweater, and a long necklace shaped like a small silver leaf. Maris had the quiet energy of someone who believed creativity could make people breathe easier. She noticed Maddox standing near the shelves and gave a friendly nod. "You're the man with the shepherd," she said. Her voice was warm and curious, not intrusive. "That obvious too?" Maddox replied. Maris laughed softly. "In a town this size, dogs have reputations faster than people." Sable sat calmly beside Maddox, observing the room. One of the children dropped a pencil, and the dog's ears flicked toward the sound before settling again. Maris knelt beside a girl's drawing. "Nice trees," she said gently. "Maybe add some shadows here." Then she straightened and approached Maddox. Elena mentioned someone new had moved into the cabin by the forest. Maddox studied her expression. "You know Elena well?" Maris shrugged slightly. "Well enough." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the window where the greenhouse roof could be seen beyond the trees. "She works harder than anyone in town," Maris said. There was a pause. Then she added quietly, "and apologizes more than anyone, too." Maddox didn't respond. Maris watched Sable instead. The dog had shifted his attention toward the greenhouse again. Maris noticed. "She's out there most afternoons," she said. "Sometimes longer than she needs to be." Her tone held no accusation, only concern. That evening, as the sun began sinking behind the pine hills, Sable suddenly stopped walking along the path behind the library. This time the stop was sharper. The dog turned and pulled gently toward the backside of the greenhouse, away from the main entrance. Maddox allowed the leash to slacken. Sable moved with purpose through a narrow strip of gravel and weeds until they reached a hidden space behind the building. It was a small, wind-sheltered corner, invisible from the road. There stood a rusted iron chair, its paint peeling. On the ground lay the remains of a ceramic coffee mug, shattered long ago but never fully cleaned up. Nearby were 3 overturned clay plant pots, soil dried into dark clumps. The space carried a strange stillness. Sable stepped forward and sniffed the ground slowly. Then he sat, facing the empty chair, watching it the way he watched people, as if someone had been there not long ago. Maddox felt a faint tightening in his chest. Places carried memories. Animals sometimes noticed them first. The next few days confirmed what Maddox had begun to suspect. Elena appeared everywhere Judith did. At the greenhouse, at a town planning meeting. Once outside the post office carrying folders that bore the logo of the Vale Community Foundation. She moved efficiently and politely through conversations, always speaking with a calm tone. But Maddox noticed something subtle. Elena rarely initiated anything. She responded to requests, to instructions, to schedules, to expectations. One afternoon, he saw her leave the greenhouse alone just before sunset. She walked down toward the lake path with quick, quiet steps. Sable noticed too. Without prompting, the dog shifted direction toward the wooden pier extending into the water. Maddox followed. The lake had grown calm again, its surface reflecting the fading sky. At the end of the pier stood Elena. She leaned lightly against the railing, staring out at the water. Up close, Maddox could see the faint shadows under her eyes. Work fatigue, maybe, or something else. Sable approached slowly. Elena turned. For a moment she seemed startled. Then her shoulders softened when she saw the dog. "He remembers me," she said quietly. Her voice carried a gentle tone, but there was a tiredness beneath it. Sable stepped closer and sat beside her. Elena hesitated before reaching down. Her hand rested lightly on the dog's head. The shepherd leaned into the touch. For several seconds, none of them spoke. Finally, Maddox said, "Long day?" Elena gave a faint smile. "They usually are." She looked back toward town. The greenhouse lights had just flickered on. From this distance, the building looked peaceful, almost glowing. Elena watched it for a long moment. Then she said something unexpected. "Some places look beautiful from the outside." She paused. "But if you stay inside them long enough..." Her fingers tightened slightly in Sable's fur. "You forget where the doors are." The words hung in the evening air. Maddox didn't interrupt. Sable rested his head gently against her wrist. For a second, Elena's composure cracked. Tears appeared in her eyes. She turned her face away quickly and wiped them. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. The apology came so fast it sounded rehearsed. Maddox noticed. So did Sable. The dog stayed beside her, quiet, steady. And for the first time since arriving in Brightwater Cove, Maddox realized something with growing certainty. The signals he was seeing here weren't loud. They weren't violent. They weren't even obvious, but they were there. And people had been ignoring them for a very long time. Spring reached its brightest moment in Brightwater Cove during the Wildflower Festival, an event the town had celebrated for nearly 2 decades. By the time Maddox Varren woke that Saturday morning, the streets had already begun transforming. Banners made of painted cloth stretched between lampposts. Stalls lined the road near the lake, each one decorated with bundles of wildflowers gathered from the nearby hills. Purple lupine, yellow buttercups, and clusters of white trillium. Music drifted from a small wooden stage near the waterfront where a group of local musicians tuned their instruments. The entire town seemed to glow under the clear northern sky. For most people, the festival meant celebration. For Elena Wren, it meant responsibility. The community greenhouse had become the centerpiece of the event. Visitors walked through the long glass structure, admiring rows of seedlings and newly blooming plants arranged into carefully planned displays. Inside, Elena moved from table to table with quiet efficiency. She wore the same simple clothing Maddox had seen before, her beige cardigan, pale blouse, and gray trousers. But today her sleeves were rolled higher as she worked quickly. Up close, the exhaustion beneath her calm expression was easier to see. Her movements were precise but rushed. Several volunteers tried to help, but Elena gently redirected them, checking labels, adjusting trays, watering plants. It was clear she had organized nearly everything herself. Maddox stood near the entrance with Sable, watching the steady flow of visitors. The dog remained calm despite the noise, his ears shifting occasionally at sudden sounds, children laughing, metal stands clinking, footsteps on the wooden walkway. But whenever Elena passed nearby, Sable's attention followed her. Near midday, a small group gathered beside the greenhouse entrance. At the center stood Judith Vale. Even in a crowd, Judith carried an unmistakable presence. Her cream-colored coat had been replaced with a tailored soft gray spring jacket, and a silk scarf rested neatly at her neck. Her posture remained straight, confident, every movement controlled with quiet grace. Beside her stood a woman Maddox had not seen before. This woman held a microphone and wore a navy blazer over a white blouse. A small camera crew adjusted equipment nearby. Her name, as Maddox soon overheard, was Lauren Devereaux. Lauren looked to be in her early 30s, tall and slender with long dark blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her sharp blue eyes carried the alert focus of someone used to observing people for a living. She was a regional journalist covering small-town stories for a lifestyle magazine that often highlighted community success projects. Lauren smiled warmly toward the camera. Brightwater Cove has become known across the county for its community initiatives, she said into the microphone, and much of that success traces back to one woman. She turned slightly toward Judith. Judith Vale. The small crowd applauded politely. Judith raised a modest hand as if deflecting attention. "Oh, please," she said with a gentle laugh. "Nothing here would exist without the people who care for it." Her eyes drifted toward Elena, and especially without Elena Wren. Elena froze briefly when her name was spoken. Then she walked over, brushing dirt lightly from her hands before joining them. Lauren smiled at her. "Elena, we've heard you've been running the greenhouse program for several years now." Before Elena could answer, Judith spoke smoothly. Elena came to Brightwater Cove during a very difficult time in her life, Judith said. She had lost almost everything. We simply gave her a place to begin again. Her tone was warm, compassionate, the kind of voice people trusted instinctively. Elena has turned that opportunity into something beautiful, Judith continued. She's proof that when a community supports someone, lives can change. Lauren nodded approvingly. That's a wonderful story. She turned the microphone slightly toward Elena. How did you feel when you first arrived here? Elena opened her mouth, but Judith answered again. She was quiet back then, Judith said gently, still finding her footing. The crowd chuckled softly. Elena forced a small smile. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table beside her. Maddox noticed. Sable noticed too. The dog's head lifted. As Lauren continued the interview, the camera lens briefly shifted toward the rows of plants behind them. At that exact moment, Sable rose slowly to his feet. He wasn't reacting to noise. The music outside continued. Children still laughed near the entrance. But something about Elena's breathing had changed. Subtle, almost invisible. Sable stepped closer to her side, not touching, just standing near enough that his shoulder nearly brushed her leg. From where Maddox stood, he saw something no one else seemed to notice. Elena's smile remained perfectly polite, but the muscles along her jaw were tightening with every sentence Judith spoke. And the dog, without any command, had positioned himself beside her like a silent anchor. The interview ended with applause. Lauren thanked Judith and the volunteers before moving on to film other parts of the festival. Judith rested a light hand on Elena's shoulder again. You did wonderfully, she said. Her voice carried approval, but also expectation. Elena nodded. Thank you. The moment looked ordinary to anyone watching. Yet when Judith stepped away to greet another group of visitors, Elena exhaled slowly, as though she had been holding her breath for a long time. The festival continued through the afternoon. Music filled the streets. Local vendors sold handmade crafts and fresh bread. Families walked between the greenhouse and the lakeside stalls. Maddox stayed mostly on the edges of the crowd. He noticed something else as the day went on. Every conversation about Elena sounded exactly the same. She's lucky Judith took her in. Judith gave her everything. That girl wouldn't have made it without her. Each version of the story sounded identical, clean, simple, and always centered around Judith. As evening approached, the sky softened into shades of orange and pale pink. The festival lights began turning on one by one. Inside the greenhouse, volunteers packed away unused supplies. But Elena was nowhere to be seen. Maddox noticed first. Sable noticed sooner. The dog suddenly turned his head toward the far end of the festival street. His ears lifted. Without waiting, Sable began moving quickly through the crowd. Maddox followed. They passed the last row of vendor stalls, crossed the narrow road near the old lighthouse trail, and continued along a gravel path that curved toward the rocky edge of the lake. The music faded behind them. Wind from the water grew stronger. Finally, they reached the old lighthouse ruins, a structure that had not operated for decades. The tower itself had been dismantled years earlier, but a low stone wall remained beside the shore. Behind that wall sat Elena. She was leaning forward, elbows on her knees, breathing unevenly. Her shoulders rose and fell as she tried to steady herself. Sable slowed as he approached. The dog stopped a few feet away. Elena looked up. For a moment, panic flashed across her face, then recognition followed. "Oh," she whispered. She wiped quickly at her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disappear." Maddox stood nearby but didn't step closer. "You don't have to apologize." Elena shook her head automatically. It's just a busy day. She tried to laugh, but the sound broke halfway through. For several seconds, the only sound was the wind moving across the lake. Finally, Elena spoke again. Judith never forced me to stay, she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. She helped me when I had nowhere else to go. She looked out toward the distant lights of the festival. But now, everything is tied to her. She counted softly on her fingers. My job records, the housing program I stayed in, the letters she wrote recommending me to the town council. Her gaze dropped to the ground. If I leave, she hesitated, then finished the thought. The story changes. Maddox waited. Elena looked back toward town. She'll never shout, Elena said softly. She doesn't need to. A long silence followed. Then Elena whispered the fear she had never said aloud before. In Brightwater Cove, I won't be the girl who rebuilt her life. Her voice nearly disappeared in the wind. I'll be the girl who betrayed the woman who saved her. Sable stepped forward then. The German shepherd rested his head gently against Elena's knee. The simple contact broke something inside her. For a moment, Elena covered her face and cried, only for a few seconds. Then she wiped her eyes again and straightened. I'm sorry, she said automatically. The apology came so fast it felt like habit. Maddox looked at the dog beside her. Sable remained still, steady, and Maddox understood something that had been forming quietly in his mind. Elena wasn't trapped by a locked door. She was trapped by a story everyone believed. The morning after the festival ended, Brightwater Cove returned to its ordinary rhythm. The banners were gone. Flower stalls had been packed away. Only faint traces of petals remained along the sidewalks where the wind had scattered them during the night. For most of the town, the celebration had been a success. For Maddox Varren, it had confirmed something he could no longer ignore. The problem in Brightwater Cove was not loud. It wasn't violent, but it was everywhere. Maddox stood on the porch of his cabin with a mug of black coffee, watching fog rise slowly from the lake. Sable lay at the edge of the wooden steps, head resting on his paws though his eyes remained open. The German shepherd's ears twitched at distant sounds. The rumble of a truck somewhere down the road, a bird cutting across the mist. The dog looked peaceful, but Maddox knew better. Animals didn't forget patterns once they noticed them. Neither did soldiers. The conversation by the lighthouse had shifted something inside him. Elena had not asked for help, but that didn't mean help wasn't needed. Maddox had spent enough years studying danger to know that the quietest problems were often the hardest to escape. So he decided to do something he had avoided since arriving. He started asking questions. The nearest town with a courthouse sat about 30 minutes south, a place called Hollow Creek. It was larger than Brightwater Cove, but still small enough that people recognized unfamiliar vehicles in parking lots. Maddox parked beside a narrow brick building that held a handful of offices on the second floor. One of them belonged to Naomi Kessler. Her name was painted neatly across the frosted glass door, Kessler Legal Services. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Naomi Kessler sat behind a desk stacked with folders. She looked to be around 41, tall and straight-backed with an air of quiet discipline. Her dark brown hair was cut into a sharp bob that framed her face just below the jawline. A pair of thin rectangular glasses rested on the bridge of her nose. Her features were angular, high cheekbones, narrow nose, and her eyes were a sharp gray-green, the kind that measured people carefully before deciding what they thought of them. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, sleeves rolled slightly as if she preferred practicality over formality. Naomi had the posture of someone used to courtroom arguments, direct, unimpressed. When Maddox explained why he was there, she listened without interrupting. Her expression remained neutral. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "So," she said calmly, "you're telling me a respected philanthropist in a lakeside town is secretly controlling a woman's life through paperwork?" Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "You realize how that sounds?" "Yeah," Maddox said. Naomi tapped a pen against her desk. "Suspicious behavior and illegal behavior aren't the same thing." "Didn't say it was illegal." She studied him again. Then something about his tone made her pause. "You're serious," she said. Maddox nodded once. "Look at the foundation documents." Naomi hesitated. Then she reached for a nearby folder. The Vale Community Foundation had been registered legally for years. On paper, everything appeared respectable. Scholarships, community programs, housing assistance. But as Naomi began flipping through documents, her brow slowly tightened. "These contracts?" she murmured. She slid one across the desk. "Look here!" The paperwork showed Elena's position with the greenhouse program, but the wording was strange. The job description was vague. The salary structure moved through the foundation rather than the town. More unusual were the attached documents labeled Community Support Agreements. "These aren't standard employment contracts," Naomi said. She pointed to a paragraph. "See this phrase?" Maddox leaned closer. Acknowledgement of continuing community support. "What does that mean?" he asked. Naomi exhaled slowly. "It means nothing legally." She tapped the page again. "But psychologically, it means everything." Another document described housing assistance Elena had received years earlier. The language implied that the foundation had guided her reintegration into stable community life. "That's not illegal," Naomi said, "but it builds a narrative." She looked up. "A narrative where leaving looks like betrayal." Maddox nodded. "Exactly." Naomi sat quietly for a moment. Finally, she said, "This is clever." She closed the folder. "Not criminal, but manipulative." As Naomi gathered the documents, she paused suddenly. "There's something else." She pulled a second folder from the cabinet. "This one isn't public." Inside were internal accounting summaries connected to the foundation. At first glance, they looked routine, but Naomi pointed to several entries. "See these?" They were labeled Community Reintegration Stipend. Multiple names appeared. Most had small amounts listed, but Elena's entry extended across several years. "Those payments stopped 3 years ago," Naomi said. "Right around the time Elena started running the greenhouse full-time." Maddox frowned. "So?" Naomi leaned back slowly. "That means Elena stopped receiving assistance." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Yet the documents still frame her as someone under the foundation's support." She tapped the page once, "Which keeps the story alive." The room grew quiet. Outside, a truck drove past the courthouse. Naomi closed the folder gently. "That's not law," she said. "That's reputation management." The next piece of the puzzle came from someone much closer to Brightwater Cove. Owen Mercer. Maddox met him 2 evenings later behind the small grocery store near the marina. Owen had agreed to talk only after Naomi contacted him privately. He arrived nervously, glancing over his shoulder as if worried someone might recognize him. Owen looked to be in his mid-50s, thin and slightly hunched with narrow shoulders. His light brown hair was thinning across the top, and he wore a wrinkled button-down shirt tucked loosely into worn slacks. He carried a canvas briefcase clutched tightly against his side. The man had the uneasy manner of someone who preferred spreadsheets to conversations. "Mr. Varren?" he asked quietly. Maddox nodded. Owen adjusted his glasses nervously. "I only agreed to speak because Naomi said this wasn't official." His voice carried the careful caution of someone who had spent years avoiding conflict. I don't want trouble. You're not in trouble, Maddox said. Owen swallowed. Well, I help with some of the accounting for the foundation. He opened the briefcase slightly. I've always assumed everything was legitimate. But, Owen shifted his weight, some of the paperwork is written strangely. How? Language, Owen said. He pulled out several photocopies. Instead of calling certain payments grants, they're described as community trust investments. He flipped to another page, and letters of recommendation always reference the foundation's support. Maddox understood. Even when Elena no longer needed help, the system kept reminding everyone she once had. Owen rubbed his hands together nervously. Judith's not a cruel person, he said quickly. She's helped a lot of people. But systems like this, he looked down. They make it very hard for someone to leave without looking ungrateful. Over the next week, Maddox watched Elena more carefully. Not like a detective, just as someone paying attention. Every interaction followed the same quiet pattern. Judith rarely gave direct orders. But her presence shaped everything around Elena. Meeting schedules, volunteer assignments, public appearances, and always the same story repeated by others. Judith gave her everything. Sable noticed the strain before anyone else did. Whenever Elena's shoulders tightened or her breathing shortened, the dog would shift closer, not dramatically, just enough that she could feel the solid weight of him nearby, like an anchor in water. One evening, Maddox saw Elena alone near the greenhouse again. The sunset painted the glass panels orange. She stood inside checking plant trays, unaware anyone was watching. For a moment, she simply leaned both hands on the table, head lowered, breathing slowly, the posture of someone holding themselves together. Sable sat quietly beside Maddox on the path. The dog's ears twitched. Then he did something unusual. He walked forward and lay down directly outside the greenhouse door. Not barking, not scratching, just waiting. When Elena eventually opened the door, she stopped, surprised to see the shepherd there. For a long moment she stared at him. Then she knelt. Her hand rested gently against Sable's head. "You're persistent," she murmured softly. Maddox watched from a distance, and he realized something with growing clarity. Judith hadn't trapped Elena with force. She had woven a story the town repeated every day, a story that made freedom look like betrayal, and the hardest chains to break were the ones people believed were kindness. The wind arrived in Brightwater Cove before dawn. It began as a restless whisper moving through the pine forest above the lake, sliding along the branches and rattling loose needles onto the ground. By mid-morning, the whisper had become a steady current pushing across the town streets. By afternoon, it had grown into something stronger. Windows rattled. Loose signs swung back and forth. The lake's smooth surface broke into restless ripples that slapped against the wooden pier. For most people, it was just weather. For Maddox Varren, it felt like the kind of day when things that had been standing quietly for a long time finally started to move. He stood on the gravel road outside the greenhouse just before sunset, watching the sky darken into thick gray clouds. Sable sat beside him, posture alert but calm. The German shepherd's golden and black coat shifted in the wind, his ears constantly adjusting to the sounds carried through the air. Metal clanging somewhere near the marina, branches creaking high above the forest line. The dog had been restless all afternoon. Not anxious, just attentive. That kind of attentiveness usually meant something was about to happen. Inside the greenhouse, the lights were still on. Rows of plants stretched across the glass structure, their leaves trembling as gusts pushed against the walls. Maddox had not come here by accident. 2 hours earlier, his phone had buzzed with a message from Naomi Kessler. "You might want to come to the greenhouse tonight." Judith scheduled a meeting with Elena. She brought paperwork. Naomi had not explained further. She didn't need to. When Maddox pushed open the greenhouse door, the warm smell of soil and damp leaves filled the air. Elena stood near the central table. Her hair had come loose from its tie, strands of light brown hair falling across her face as she flipped through several documents laid out in front of her. She looked tired, more than tired. Her shoulders were stiff, her eyes focused on the pages with the careful concentration of someone trying to understand something under pressure. Across from her stood Judith Vale. Even here in a room shaking with wind, Judith carried herself with the same deliberate control she always had. Her silver blonde hair remained neatly tied back, though the gusts pushing through the greenhouse vents caused a few strands to lift slightly around her face. She wore a dark wool coat over her usual elegant clothes. Her posture remained straight, but her patience was thinner tonight. "You've had these agreements for a week," Judith said calmly. Her voice carried a firmness that didn't quite match her usual warmth. Elena held one of the pages up. "I don't understand why this needs to change," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. Judith stepped closer. "These adjustments simply clarify your responsibilities." Elena shook her head slightly. "The greenhouse already belongs to the Foundation." Judith's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't about ownership." She tapped the paper. "It's about continuity." Maddox leaned against a wooden support beam, watching silently. Sable sat beside him, eyes fixed on the two women. The wind outside struck the glass panels again. Elena looked down at the document. Several lines had been added, language about continued leadership roles. Extended advisory oversight, and one phrase that caught Maddox's attention immediately. Foundation guidance regarding community representation. Elena frowned. "This means I'd have to run public events through the Foundation." Judith folded her hands calmly. "You already do. But this makes it permanent." Judith's expression softened slightly. "Elena, we both know the greenhouse would not exist without the Foundation's support." Elena didn't respond. Judith stepped closer. "Nor would your position." Sable's ears lifted sharply. The dog stood, not aggressively, but firmly. For a moment he looked toward the greenhouse door. Then he walked directly between Judith and Elena. The movement was quiet, precise. Sable didn't bark. He simply placed his body there, solid, immovable. Judith stopped mid-sentence. Her gray eyes flicked down toward the dog. The greenhouse lights hummed softly above them. Outside, the wind struck the glass again. For the first time since Maddox had seen her, Judith's expression shifted, not into anger but into something sharper, awareness. She looked past Sable and met Maddox's eyes. "You've become very interested in this town for someone who just arrived," she said calmly. Naomi stepped forward from the far end of the greenhouse. Maddox hadn't even noticed her enter. She held a folder beneath her arm, her dark bobbed hair moving slightly in the wind as she crossed the room. Naomi's posture was as steady as it had been in her office. "Actually," she said, "I'm the one who asked him to come." Judith turned toward her slowly. Naomi placed the folder on the table. "I've reviewed the new agreements you prepared for Elena." Her tone was polite, but precise. "These documents extend your Foundation's authority beyond its original charter." Judith's expression remained neutral. "I'm simply protecting the programs I built." Naomi opened the folder. "These clauses create indefinite advisory control." She pointed to the text, "which is not how nonprofit governance works." Judith glanced briefly at Elena, then back to Naomi. "You're suggesting I've done something improper?" "I'm suggesting," Naomi replied calmly, "that you're redefining support in a way that makes independence difficult." The wind slammed against the greenhouse again. A loud creak echoed across the metal frame. Elena stood perfectly still. The papers in her hand trembled slightly. Judith exhaled slowly. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she turned toward Elena. "When you came here," Judith said quietly, "you had no place to go." Her voice had lost its public warmth. This tone was more personal. "You had no work, no stability, and no one in this town who knew your name." Elena's breathing slowed. Judith continued, "I gave you the greenhouse. You gave me a chance," Elena said softly. Judith tilted her head. "And now you want to walk away from that chance." Naomi watched carefully. "That's not what she said." Judith ignored her. Her attention remained fixed on Elena. "You think the town will see you the same way if you reject the Foundation's guidance?" The wind howled across the roof. A loose metal hinge clanged somewhere above them. Elena looked down at the papers again. For years, every decision she had made had passed through Judith's approval. Every public success had carried the same narrative. Judith had saved her. Judith had rebuilt her life. Judith had given her purpose. Elena's hands tightened around the pages. Her voice came slowly. "I never asked to reject anything." Judith waited. Elena lifted her head. "But I can't keep pretending that gratitude is the same thing as permission." The words hung in the greenhouse. Naomi didn't move. Maddox didn't speak. Even the wind seemed to pause for a second. Elena's voice grew steadier. "I'm grateful for what you did." Her eyes met Judith's. "But I don't owe you the rest of my life." At that exact moment, a violent gust struck the greenhouse. One of the upper panels cracked, then shattered. Glass burst outward with a sharp explosion of sound. Fragments scattered across the concrete floor. Everyone flinched. Everyone except Sable. The dog stood firm where he was. Judith stared at Elena. For the first time, her composure faltered. Not anger, something deeper, loss of control. Outside, the wind continued roaring across Brightwater Cove. Inside the greenhouse, the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. And Maddox knew that the story the town had believed for years had just begun to change. The wind that had shattered the greenhouse glass passed during the night. By morning, Brightwater Cove looked almost unchanged. The lake had returned to its calm silver surface. Pine trees stood tall along the hills, their branches swaying only slightly in the gentle breeze that followed the storm. The wooden pier stretched quietly into the water as fishermen resumed their early routines. But inside the town, something subtle had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that people began asking questions they had never asked before. 3 days after the confrontation in the greenhouse, the Brightwater Cove Town Council called a meeting. The council gathered inside the small municipal hall near the marina, a white-painted building that had served as the town's administrative center for nearly 40 years. At the center table sat Arthur Bellamy, the council chair. Arthur Bellamy was a tall man in his early 60s with broad shoulders that hinted at a younger life spent doing physical work. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and a thick salt and pepper mustache framed his mouth. He wore a navy jacket over a flannel shirt, the kind of clothing that balanced formality with the relaxed character of a lakeside town. Arthur had been a commercial fisherman for most of his life before retiring into local politics. His reputation was simple, fair-minded, slow to anger, and careful with decisions. Beside him sat the other council members. Stacks of documents lay across the table. Most of them carried the same title: Vale Community Foundation Review. Judith Vale attended the meeting. She sat near the front row, posture still composed, though the quiet confidence she once carried had softened. Her clothing remained elegant, A pale gray coat, pearl earrings, carefully styled hair, but the atmosphere around her had changed. People were no longer simply admiring her. They were listening differently. Arthur Bellamy cleared his throat. The council has reviewed concerns regarding the administrative structure of the Vale Foundation. His voice carried steady authority. There is no evidence of criminal activity. Several people in the room exhaled quietly. Arthur continued. However, there are concerns regarding conflicts of interest and governance procedures. He folded his hands. Therefore, the council recommends that the foundation transition into a community oversight model. Judith listened silently. Arthur finished, which means Mrs. Vale will step down from direct operational authority. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Some people nodded, others frowned. Brightwater Cove had admired Judith for years. Changing that narrative wasn't easy, but the story had begun to shift. Outside the council hall, opinions spread through the town like wind through tall grassoon. Some residents spoke quietly near the bakery. Others discussed the situation while tying boats at the marina. Not everyone agreed. Some believed Judith had simply been misunderstood. Others wondered why no one had questioned the system earlier. But one thing was clear. People were now seeing the story from more than one angle. That evening, Sable walked with Maddox along the lake road. The air felt calmer than it had in days. The shepherd's pace was slower too, almost thoughtful. As they approached the greenhouse, Sable suddenly stopped, not abruptly, just enough that Maddox noticed. The dog lifted his head slightly toward the glass structure. For several seconds he stood still. Then quietly he lay down in the grass beside the path, not guarding, not alert, simply resting. Maddox studied the dog. For months, Sable had carried tension whenever they passed this place. Now the shepherd's breathing slowed, his eyes closed halfway. For the first time since arriving in Brightwater Cove, the dog looked completely at ease. The greenhouse reopened 2 weeks later. This time it was run differently. Instead of reporting through the Vale Foundation, the building now operated under a community cooperative program. Volunteers helped manage planting schedules. Local students assisted with seasonal workshops, and Elena Wren no longer worked there alone. She had moved into a small rented room above Harlow's bookshop on Main Street. The shop belonged to Catherine Harlow, a woman in her late 50s with short auburn hair and a warm, round face that carried permanent smile lines around her eyes. Catherine stood barely 5'3", but her voice had the lively energy of someone who loved conversation. She had owned the bookstore for nearly 20 years and treated the upstairs apartment like an extension of the shop, safe, quiet, and always filled with the faint scent of old pages. "You can stay as long as you need," Catherine had told Elena the day she moved in. "No deadlines, no expectations." Elena had nodded, still uncertain how to respond to kindness that didn't carry conditions. Her routine slowly changed. 3 mornings a week she worked at the Brightwater Library, helping Maris organize community art classes and children's reading groups. On other days, she volunteered at the Greenhouse Cooperative, not as the person responsible for everything, just as one of many hands helping the plants grow. The difference felt strange at first. For years, Elena had carried every task herself. Now she found herself learning something unfamiliar. How to leave work unfinished without guilt. How to trust others to help. Maddox continued living quietly in his cabin near the forest. He never tried to become a leader in town. That wasn't his role. Occasionally he helped repair equipment at the greenhouse or fixed broken boards along the wooden walkway near the lake, but mostly he stayed on the edges of things. Observing, letting the town settle into its new balance. Judith Vale left Brightwater Cove a month later. Not dramatically. No speeches, no confrontation. One morning her car simply drove south along the highway. Some residents felt relief. Others felt sadness. Judith had done good work once. But even good intentions could become something else when control replaced generosity. Brightwater Cove slowly learned to hold both truths at the same time. Summer arrived gradually. Wildflowers returned to the hills. Children began spending afternoons by the lake again. The greenhouse filled with new rows of native plants used for local restoration projects. And Elena's shoulders slowly relaxed in a way Maddox had never seen before. One quiet afternoon near the end of June, the greenhouse door opened again. A woman stood hesitantly at the entrance. She looked around, 35, tall and slender, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid that rested over one shoulder. Her name, as Elena later learned, was Lena Morales. Lena's face carried the pale stillness of someone who had traveled a long distance without knowing exactly where she would end up. Faint scars marked her knuckles, old injuries that had healed but not entirely faded. She wore a simple denim jacket and held a canvas bag against her chest. For several seconds she stood at the doorway without stepping inside, as if unsure she was allowed. Sable noticed her first. The German shepherd walked calmly across the greenhouse floor and sat directly in front of her, not blocking the entrance, just waiting. Lena looked down at the dog, her shoulders dropped slightly. "Hi there," she murmured. Sable tilted his head gently, amber eyes steady. Behind them, Elena approached slowly. She recognized that expression immediately. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the quiet fear of stepping into a place that might expect something in return. Elena stopped a few feet away. Then she opened the door wider. "You can come in," she said gently. Lena hesitated. "What if I'm just looking?" "That's okay." Lena stepped inside. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I heard this place helps people start over." Elena shook her head softly. "No." She smiled faintly. "This place just lets people stay." Lena looked confused. Elena gestured toward the rows of plants. "No one here has to owe their life to be welcome." The words settled quietly in the room. Sable wagged his tail once. Later that evening, Maddox stood on the wooden pier watching the lake. The sun dipped low behind the pine hills, casting long reflections across the water. Sable lay beside him, stretched comfortably across the boards. The dog's breathing was slow, peaceful. Maddox rested one hand on the shepherd's shoulder. For a long time he watched the calm surface of the lake. Then he spoke softly. "You weren't looking for trouble, were you?" Sable opened one eye. Maddox smiled slightly. "You were just paying attention." The dog's tail thumped once against the wood, and for the first time in years, Maddox realized something he had been carrying since the mission that had haunted him. Instinct wasn't about danger. Sometimes it was simply about noticing the moment when someone needed the world to stop and listen. Sable had never been searching for problems. He had only refused to walk past the moments that mattered. Sometimes they arrive in the quiet moments when someone chooses to stop, look closer, and care. In Brightwater Cove, nothing supernatural happened. There were no dramatic rescues, no heroes descending from the sky. What changed everything was something much simpler. A man who decided to pay attention. A dog that refused to ignore fear, and a woman who finally remembered that gratitude should never cost someone their freedom. Many people in life carry invisible burdens. From the outside, everything can look calm, successful, even beautiful. But inside, someone may feel trapped by expectations, reputation, or the quiet pressure of a story that others keep repeating about them. And sometimes God speaks not through loud voices, but through instinct, compassion, and courage. Through the small voice that says, "Pause. Something here matters." Maddox did not save Elena by force. He simply listened when the moment asked for attention. He trusted the quiet signal that something was not right, and in that pause, space was created for truth, for freedom, and for a new beginning. In our daily lives, we may pass by people who are carrying silent struggles, a coworker who always apologizes too quickly, a neighbor who smiles but seems tired in a way that sleep cannot fix, a friend who never asks for help. Maybe the miracle begins when we notice. Maybe the miracle begins when we choose not to walk past. Faith is not only about believing in great wonders. Sometimes faith is about believing that kindness, courage, and attention can change someone's life in ways we may never fully see. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what moment in the story stayed with you the most. Your words may encourage someone else who is quietly searching for a way forward. And if you enjoy stories about faith, compassion, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your path, and guide you gently through every season of your life. And may He give you the wisdom to notice the quiet moments when a small act of care can become someone else's miracle.